skitter by the real issues, because if you don't have no one is ever going to have no one is ever going to hold Reformed theology if you are not absolutely convinced that God has spoken. And we have shown over and over and over again how individuals who have left the Reformed movement have likewise abandoned a high view of Scripture. And which came first in their particular situation isn't necessarily the issue, but it is quite obvious that many of these individuals, these formerly Reformed people, are on a slide. There's no handholds to stop them. There are no scrub brushes to grab on the way over the cliff. They're on a slide to where they must do what people like Brian Zond have done, and that is to allegorize or in some other way find a means of abandoning the true and full inspiration and meaning of the Tanakh. Remember my discussion with Brian Zond, and I kept talking about the Tanakh and finally said, what's the Tanakh? And at the time, he was writing a commentary on an Old Testament book for some publishing house. And I'm just like, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Tanakh, the law, the prophets, the writings, standard terminology used of what Christians normally call the Old Testament, but what is probably even better called the Tanakh. Because not everything in the Old Testament is specifically about the Old Covenant or something like that. It's more often described in the New Testament by the law, or the prophets, or things like that. And when you listen to Zond in his debate with Michael Brown on penal substitutionary atonement, when you listen to him in his debate on Calvinism, remember on Radio Free Geneva, we played that stuff. We played his sections and reviewed his comments in the debate. It was absolutely crystal clear that the only way that he could attack Reformed theology was to fundamentally attack the consistency and inspiration of the Scripture itself. And once you do that, once you no longer have an inspired body, then you get to pick and choose what you're going to put together according to your predilections, according to what you like. And that's why the God of the emergent movement and those who in our day are just trying to produce something that will keep the millennials happy, that God ends up looking shockingly like us, instead of being the sovereign of the Old Testament. Because not only have I been preaching through the Holiness Code, I'm now in Deuteronomy, dealing with tough stuff, dealing with very, very difficult material. But we're also reading through pretty much same section. We're now in Joshua in the evening service. Reformed Baptists have a tradition where most of us anyways read a chapter of the New Testament in the morning, a chapter of the Old Testament in the evening, in our morning and evening services on the Lord's Day. And so we're somewhere in Joshua right now in the evenings. And man, there's tough stuff in there. I mean, Judges is coming up, and there's the toughest stuff, except for a couple sections in Ezekiel right there. And most of us know that stuff's there. I mean, most serious Christians have read the Bible. If you haven't yet, I would highly suggest having the discipline to do that. It's not all that long, actually, but we know it's there. And a lot of people just simply want to try to avoid it. They don't want to deal with the destruction of the Amorites. Just last Sunday night, I read the section about the destruction of the king of Jerusalem, and a couple of other of the city-states around Jerusalem, and Joshua goes in and wiped out every living creature in those cities in just a matter of days. And modern people look at that, and because we have never seen plague, at least in Western culture, most of us now have never lived through war. Here in the United States, we've never really experienced war on our own soil in our lifetimes. Obviously, people in the 1860s fully understood that. But because we've not seen these things, then we are extremely sensitive to the very idea of God having anything to do with any of that. And for most people, if you don't understand the holiness of God, if you don't understand his kingly freedom, if you've been brought to the faith with this namby-pamby milquetoast, God is your girlfriend type of presentation, you have no foundation upon which to even begin to understand God's role in history, let alone your own relationship to God. And so, for many of these people, they have no problem whatsoever putting God in the dock, putting God on the witness stand, or making him the defendant, actually, and demanding that he justify his actions in this world. And, of course, the result is they end up with a God that, from their perspective, really doesn't have anything to do with what's going on in this world anyway. Has nothing to do with it. And so, despite the clarity of Daniel chapter 4 and the reality that a pagan king can come to understand that God does whatever God chooses to do, and no one can stay his hand, despite the repeated statements of God hardening this king's heart to destroy this people and keeping this person from sinning against him, but judging this person, the freedom with which God can grant his mercy and grace, because all are guilty before him, all are under his wrath, the expression of his wrath against sinful mankind, not only in the destruction of the peoples in Canaan for their sin by Israel, but supernatural things, plagues and hail and so on and